Hi, I'm U.S. Army National Guard veteran Sean Claiborne, and welcome to America's Heroes Group, our roundtable for Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. September is National Suicide Prevention Awareness and Hispanic Heritage Month, and we have with us Cara, did I say it right? Cara Anthony, KFF Health News journalist. And we're going to talk about her article and a documentary she's working on and a podcast along with that called Silence in Sikeston.
Yeah,
So how you
thanks for
doing,
having
Cara?
me.
All right, keep
Good.
calling Cara.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Sean. I'm glad to be here.
It's my pleasure. So tell me who Lemon Anthony is, a World War II vet that was part of he was a member of your family, and what happened to him.
Yeah, Lehman Anthony is my great uncle. He was unfortunately killed by the police in West Tennessee in 1946. I recently penned an essay about his killing, which was sort of a family secret for a long time. My dad, I had a conversation with him about what happened to our uncle, and it just led to a larger conversation about why we need to talk about racial trauma in America and why it's okay to break the silence about that. And so it's been a long journey, but I'm glad that we're here because hopefully other families can also have these conversations.
Now, your uncle was from the Bootheel. Tell us about the Bootheel and what it's like to live there.
So my uncle, so I've been doing a lot of work in the Bootheel. My uncle actually was in West Tennessee. That's where most of our family is from. But the Bootheel of Missouri is the southeast corner of Missouri where I've been doing a lot of work. And so that and looking at the little told history of racial trauma there. And as I was telling these stories and interviewing other Black families in that part of the country, my dad kind of said, "Hey, wait a minute. Do you know about our family's history, our past?" And that's when my Uncle Lehman's story really came to the forefront. And my dad had been holding on to our Uncle Lehman's story for like at least a decade before he shared it with me. But yeah, I've been looking into racial violence and police killings in the Bootheel of Missouri for the past 4 years. And I think right after year one or so, my dad said, "Okay, daughter, let's have a conversation about us." And so it led to this essay, and soon a podcast episode will be dropped about what happened to my uncle.
And you have a full-length documentary coming out. Is that tomorrow? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's out. It's out. It's available on all on YouTube, the PBS app, World Channel. If you have World Channel, it's available there as well. And it's a feature-length documentary that tells the story about the community that I've been looking at, Sikeston, Missouri, for the last 4 years. And it tells the story of a lynching that happened there in 1942. And it talks about how particularly Black people in the community didn't feel safe enough to talk about that lynching, even though they were living under the weight and strain of it, even today. And so we go all the way from 1942 to 2020, and we examine the silence around that lynching, but also a police killing of a young man named Denzel Taylor, who was shot and killed by Sikeston police in 2020, just a few months before George Floyd was killed by the police. And so while the country was erupting for what happened to George Floyd in Sikeston, people remain mostly silent around this particular police killing. And so that's one thing that we discuss. We talk about why it's difficult to have these conversations, but why they're absolutely necessary. And so you can learn more about that in the podcast, which really talks about the public health impact.
Why do you think it is that African Americans, Black people, we tend to not talk about these things to even yet today? And how dangerous is that when you look at history? Because this is not just what's going on in Sikeston that's not being talked about, but the race riots that have been forgotten and kind of almost erased from history. Tulsa, Oklahoma, here in Bronzeville, in Chicago, all these different stories of Black neighborhoods being burned to the ground, race riots, things along those lines. Why are we so silent?
deeply connected to safety, right? Even now, people have questions. They've asked questions about my personal safety and unearthing these stories, but people didn't talk about it because they didn't want the same thing to happen to them or their family members. And today, I think we are grappling with this idea of, are we better? Are we healed? Can we move on? We don't need to talk about these issues anymore. But in the podcast, we say, like, yes, we absolutely need to have these conversations, because generation after generation is dealing with the issue of racism, racial violence in some kind of way. Even when we don't talk about it, you're living with the wound that's almost like we need to have major surgery, right? And not just put a Band-Aid on it and say, hey, everything is fine. So that way we can move forward, to have a better future, to live longer and healthier lives. But I think a lot of the silence today could also be connected to some shame. Let's just be honest. It's not fun to talk about these things. People have buried these histories for years because we don't want to say that happened to us, or that happened to our family, or we were the type that we fought back. We didn't take things lying down. But it's like, the reality is, it's like these things happen all the time, and it's okay to discuss them. But a lot of times you'll hear my aunt talk about it in the podcast, is that so many families for years, Black families, felt powerless. And that's something that we can all empathize with, but it's still important for us to really have these conversations, because it's the first step towards healing.
And your article touches on something that I think not too many people are aware of, which is the idea that these types of experiences, these negative experiences, lead to trauma, which also leads to affecting your health. So we're talking about, increases in, high blood pressure, which leads to all kinds of different things. Tell us a bit about that. And that's interesting. I wanted to give you some stats that are built upon what you wrote about in your article.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you witness something, even looking at something like a police killing online today, that can weigh on your mental health. So, yes, you can deal with anxiety, you can deal with depression, you can even become suicidal, unfortunately. And then that can also weigh on your physical health, like you mentioned, the high blood pressure, heart disease, even cancer can become more of an issue, because unfortunately, these things have an impact. And we talk about in episode 3 something called epigenetics, about how it can even weigh on your genes, your nervous system can be affected, your gut can be affected by this. And this is all backed up by studies by researchers at universities across the country. We've cited all of these things to be true. And that's also why we need to have the conversation, because a lot of times the factor that we're not discussing when it comes to our health is racism, and it can play a huge role on your health. So we go deep into that in the podcast.
So looking up some information, so American Heart Association, they say, and this is a quote off of their website and also in the report that they wrote, the rate of high blood pressure among Black people in the United States is among the highest in the world. 55% of African Americans in the United States have high blood pressure. And this, of course, leads to stroke, heart attack, kidney disease. The Journal of Hypertension says 31% of all Africans, 31% of all Africans have high blood pressure. So the entire continent of Africa, 31% versus United States, 55%. World Health Organization says about 40%, but between 31 and 40%, still way less stress going on, less incidence of high blood pressure in Africa than it is in the United States, one of the richest countries in the world. Okay. American Cancer Society, for most types of cancer, Black people have the highest death rate and the shortest survival of any racial ethnic group in the United States. Black women have a 41% increased chance, 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than white women, and also get fewer diagnoses. There's also the report on cancer facts and figures from the American Black people, on American Black people. This was a report done in 2024. They cover from 2022 to 2024. Death by assaults, homicides, and legal interventions ranks fifth, the fifth leading cause of death, and ranks 18th for whites. Fifth leading cause of death for Black people, 18th for whites. 8,854 Black deaths versus 3,823 whites, when whites basically make up close to 58% of the population. Blacks only 14%, 12 to 14%, depending on what you look at. 46 million out of a population of 333 million. Stress and trauma caused by police violence and also by this violence in general in our Black communities. What are some of the things and tools we have in our toolboxes to try to counteract this tide?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and we're making strides, even with you allowing me to be on the show today, is like starting to have a conversation. I think that's the very first step. And we talk about how the just the art of communicating about these things is difficult. It's difficult to talk about it. Sometimes people don't know what to say. That's why we named the podcast Silence in Sikeston. It's a podcast about finding the words to say the things that go unsaid. And so I think that's the very first thing people can do. But it's also really important for us to have conversations about our family's health history. That's the other thing we don't talk about a lot of times when we in Black families. We don't know who has what and what's in our bloodline and what are we more likely to get than others. And so that's really, I think, where things start. And then doing the best you can to take care of yourself. We talk about each generation has a piece of the work to do. Aisha Lee is a professor at Penn State University who I have a conversation with in episode 2. And she talks about like how these issues have compounded over generations. And so it's not going to change overnight, but rather each generation can do their part. And so I think about now, what are the steps that I can take, to be better and do better and be a healthier person. But I'm also thinking about my 7-year-old daughter as well, So I think that's the first step, is to start having conversations around these things so that we can get access to the resources and tools that we need. And then also talking to your doctor and your physician about the issues that you may be having. I've written extensively through the years about something called culturally competent care, which just says that it's important for you. A lot of times studies have shown that when a person of color or a Black person is treated by a person who is culturally competent, they have better health outcomes. And if you can't find a culturally competent doctor, maybe you can find a culturally humble doctor who will at least say, hey, I don't know everything that is going on, but I'm willing to help and hear you out and, hopefully point you in the right direction so that you can be better. And so I think those are some of the steps that we could take, seeking culturally competent care, having conversations, and thinking about the future, the next generation. All of those things are very important.
One thing I did see as a bright spot in our U.S. history is that Black folks are getting more prosperous. Poverty is decreasing. So in 1955, 55% of Blacks lived in poverty. In 2022, the U.S. Census reports that 17%, I'm sorry, lived in poverty as Black people. 11.5% across the entire United States live in poverty. 17 from 55% in 1955 to 17% in 2022. So there's progress being made there. However, we still see high prevalence of violence against in the Black community, and also perpetrated by law enforcement, and these negative health outcomes, which haven't seemed to budge really much at all over the last 70 years or so. So when you look at how generations have changed, how do white younger generations, how have you seen their attitudes change? Has racism or people's attitudes in the white community gotten better over your experience and your research?
Yeah, I think you referenced progress being made, and that's absolutely true. I think we are doing a lot better in this country when it comes to seeing Black people advance and progress. I am a mom who is now a homeowner, and I'm very proud of that. My siblings are doing very well for themselves. You see more Black Americans now in leadership roles, as they should be and as they always should have been, and that's a beautiful thing. But the reality is that racism is still a huge issue in this country, particularly institutional racism. And we talk about that as well in the podcast in episode 4. I mean, look, we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go. And hopefully, people will be able to hear that and see that and understand, that we're talking about this because it is still an issue. I think it's easy to like turn away and just say like, oh, things are better now, but it might not be what we remember. Jim Crow laws, but there are other issues now that I think that need to be directly addressed, because it's like this idea of like overt versus covert. It's like
Mhm.
it might be more subtle. I've written also about the idea of what is a microaggression. Some people have called it, researchers have called it death by 1,000 cuts. And so it's those daily interactions that so many of us still deal with and are trying to work through. And those issues weigh on your nervous system and weigh on your health. And so we might be in the boardroom, but once we get in the boardroom, sometimes we have to fight to be there and, talk about why we should be there. And that's exhausting. And so, yes, we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go.
Mhm. So how do you feel that younger white generations feel about racism? Do you think as that's improved? The reason why I bring that up is because when I remember when George Floyd was murdered, um, I saw way more Black Lives Matter signs in white neighborhoods of Chicago than I did in Black neighborhoods of Chicago. Like driving down, Lawrence Avenue, I saw like every other building, every other business had a BLM sign or a poster or something in their window. Didn't see that really hardly at all in a Black neighborhood.
Yeah, I do think that there's a younger generation, particularly you talking about white millennials who are now what people use the term, woke or awake, and awaken to the issues in a big way. But I think there is progress being made there, but there's also work that needs to be done, because it goes back to this conversation about generations and what are we passing down and what are we choosing to take on as our own beliefs and values and traditions. And so unfortunately, sometimes things that an oppressive position could be passed down. But then there are people that are breaking the mold and deciding, what, that isn't the country that I want to live in. That isn't the future that I want for myself or for my children. And so, yeah, I do think that there is a movement in this country for us to be better and to do better. And that includes, many white millennials who are, observing all of this in the same way we are.
Mm-hmm. It seems like trauma and stress I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, but trauma and stress seem to be the underlying common thread to all of these health issues. And we've said this before, people growing up in the past, my parents even telling me that, if they'd be much healthier if they weren't under so much stress all the time, trying to just get by through the day. I always thought that if you had more money, then you would have less stress. But even that is not really coming out to be true. So what are some of the things that we can do to try to alleviate some of that stress and teach our kids how to do the same?
Yeah, I think this, I can just share personally while we were making this podcast and while our team we were putting together the film, I had to remind myself, to go outside and to drink water and to move my body, and to just, I remember one day I was particularly stressed about something that we were putting together, and a friend just said, breathe. And I thought, whoa, that's revolutionary. Black rest is revolutionary. And we need to remember that, like sleep. I have a sister who's always reminding me that she's like, there needs to be one living thing or two living things on your plate. And that's her way of saying eat your vegetables. These things are important because we deserve to be healthy. We deserve to live long and free and be happy. The Black people do live with a lot of stress and heartache, and we have a lot that we go through on a daily basis, but our joy matters too. And so we have to remember to laugh and enjoy our family and friends, and to get out there in the world and just take a deep breath sometimes. So these are the things that I recommend because they're things that I've done, and therapy is so important. I can't express that enough. There's been a long time, there's a stigma in our community about not going to therapy or what that means. For generations, Black pastors stood in as therapists, barbers stood in as therapists. You go to your salon, you might talk about different things like that, but it's really important for us.
Bartenders.
Right, exactly. The bartenders, everybody. But I think it's really important for us to pursue those professionals as well, in addition to talking to people in your community about your issues, because I can't tell you how much healing comes from that alone. So.
What was the biggest thing you learned from in your journey making this podcast? What was the most impressive thing that was put upon you?
It's really important for us to understand the value of preserving these stories. So many of the people that I talk to are now gone. I talked to matriarchs of their family who remembered the lynching that happened in Sikeston, Missouri in 1942. Unfortunately, they did not live to see this film, but we captured and preserved the story. My father dealt with a number of health issues while we were making this, and while I was asking him about his uncle who was killed by the police in the 1940s. And I just couldn't imagine, I just thought about, oh my gosh, I would have hate to have lost him, and I never want to lose him, because who would want to? But just the importance of preserving these stories for the next generation so that they can learn and read about our history. It's so important to preserve our history, because that's how we get better. That's how we grow. And there's some acknowledgement. It'll help hopefully for my daughter. It'll help her connect the dots as she grows older. And so I think that's the biggest thing I learned. It's just the power of storytelling, the power of saying it out loud. At the end, I won't give it all away. People should just check out Silence in Sikeston. You'll hear more about it, but that's what I'll say.
Now, how many episodes are you going to have on your podcast, or is it going to be an ongoing thing?
It's a narrative podcast, and so you'll hear tape of me kind of going around Sikeston and doing interviews, and then a guest and I talk about the issues. And so that's the setup. So it's a 4-part limited series, and so that's it. But it's definitely worth it. A new episode drops every Tuesday, and so we hope people check it out.
Wow. I think that's really amazing the work you're doing. And I think I really do appreciate the fact that you're going through and actually bringing this history to the forefront, because so many African Americans, people that I've talked to, we'd have no idea of those experiences, particularly we see every day on the news police shootings and things along those lines. We've talked about that actually in 2 other segments just today. But we don't remember or know about the history of what happened in Tulsa, what happened in Bronzeville, what happened in many cities across the United States during the race riots, and then even race riots that weren't even put in the newspaper or silenced in the newspaper. And us not talking and sharing those stories and pass these stories on to future generations. It seems to, in a lot of ways, then not. It seems like we're losing part of our culture in that missing history. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, look, Cleo Wright's story, when I first traveled to Sikeston, Missouri, I was going down there to tell a story about a lynching that happened and to interview one person who saw it. As we did more research, I found, and a team of researchers confirmed as well, and the director of the film also confirmed, that this was America's first federally investigated lynching. The first time the FBI investigated lynching as a crime, they came to Sikeston, Missouri. And so it just reinforced the importance of this, and how, like, I was so confused. I was like, how is this not in our history books? And then it just kind of grew from there. It went from one short story that was going to be maybe 900 words to a feature-length film, a 4-part podcast, a personal essay, and a digital story that I'm working on now, because I realized, I told my editors and everyone, agreed, our team agreed that this was really important, because we are losing those histories and we need to preserve them now.
I really appreciate your time. It gives us a lot of information, a lot of things to chew on. And always, again, you kind of give us something to think about and try to study and learn more. So I definitely can't wait to see your documentary. I have checked out a couple of your podcasts, and I thought they were well put together and very wonderful. You have a great voice in your podcast. You think your voice coach is doing a good job.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Vicki Merrick, she's great. Yeah, thanks for having me on talk about this issue, Sean. It means a lot.
My pleasure. Cara Anthony, KFF Health News journalist. We talked about her documentary and podcast, Silence in Sikeston. Go check it out. It's on Amazon. Is that right?
Oh, Silence in Sikeston is available on YouTube, the PBS app, and World Channel.
All right. Thanks for your time.